In the next conversation you have today, you will do something no other species on Earth can do, and you won't even notice you're doing it. In 1861, at Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, a physician named Paul Broca met a patient who could only say one word. The word was tan. Just tan, tan, over and over, no matter what he was actually trying to say. Except once, when someone made him angry enough, one single sharp word slipped out clean, completely different from the one he was stuck on. So, if losing every word but one still leaves you able to say exactly the right thing when you're furious, where exactly does language actually live in your head? Broca had one habit that never left him, in that hospital and every one after it. He carried a small pair of calipers everywhere, and he measured things, skulls, brains, constantly, on almost every patient he ever saw. When Tan died, 5 days after Broca started treating him, Broca performed an autopsy. He found a soft, damaged patch on the left side, roughly the size of a small egg, and he was sure that patch explained why Tan could only say one word. That patch got a name, Broca's area. For the next 140 years, it was taught as the single seat of human speech, except Broca never actually looked deep inside that brain. He only looked at the surface, which means for over a century, the entire story of where language lives in the brain was built on half the evidence, and the other half of that brain is still sitting in a jar in Paris right now, waiting for anyone curious enough to actually look. Here's the actual size of the mystery. No fossil has ever recorded a single spoken word. Speech doesn't fossilize, ever. So for centuries, anyone who tried to explain where human language came from was basically guessing out loud, which went about as well as you'd expect. By 1861, an Oxford linguist named Max Muller was so annoyed by the guessing that he gave the worst theories mocking nicknames: the bow-wow theory, the ding-dong theory, the poo-poo theory, the yo-he-ho theory. He delivered the mockery live in a packed public lecture hall, and the punchlines stuck for the next century and a half. Bow-wow said language started by copying animal sounds. Ding-dong said certain sounds just naturally matched certain objects. None of it could actually be tested, and everybody knew it. By 1866, one institution got so exhausted by the arguing that it did something almost no scientific society ever does. The Société de Linguistique de Paris literally banned the topic, wrote it directly into their bylaws. No paper on the origin of language would be accepted, ever, from anyone. For nearly a century after that, serious linguists mostly avoided the subject entirely because nobody wanted to be the next name mocked in a lecture hall, which meant the actual answer sat unexamined for generations until a very different kind of evidence turned up in a cave in the Middle East. And that cave didn't just reopen the question, it broke the rule everyone thought was permanent. In 1983, archaeologists excavating Kebara Cave in Israel found a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton buried around 60,000 years earlier. Inside that skeleton was a single small horseshoe-shaped bone that almost never survives in the fossil record, the hyoid, the bone your voice box hangs from. In 1989, researcher Baruch Arensberg and his team published their measurements of it in the journal Nature, and the shape was almost identical to yours, which was a direct hit against a theory that had dominated the field for over a decade. Back in 1971, researchers Philip Lieberman and Edmund Krellin had reconstructed a Neanderthal vocal tract from the La Chapelle-aux-Saints skull discovered in France back in 1908, and concluded Neanderthals physically couldn't produce a full range of vowel sounds. For years, that conclusion got repeated as settled fact. Neanderthals grunted. Modern humans talked. The hyoid bone from Kebara didn't just complicate that story. It undercut the entire premise it was built on. There's a part of this field that was slow to admit out loud. The same measuring methods Broca helped popularize were later used by others to try to rank entire human populations by skull size. That misuse doesn't erase what Broca actually found about language, but it's part of the record, and skipping it would be its own kind of dishonesty. Back to the actual science. If Neanderthals had a modern-shaped voice box 60,000 years ago, the obvious next question is whether they had the brain wiring to use it. That question sat unanswered until genetics caught up decades later. In 2001, geneticist Simon Fisher and his team at Oxford identified a gene behind a rare, severe speech disorder running through 3 generations of one British family, known in the research simply as the KE family. About half the family could barely form clear sentences. The gene responsible was called FOXP2, FOXP2, and it was the first gene ever directly linked to human language. Scientists studying that family did their own kind of measuring, tracking exactly which relatives could speak clearly and which couldn't, generation by generation, with the same obsessive precision Broca once put into a skull. Here's where it gets stranger. In 2007, a team led by Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute extracted DNA from Neanderthal bones found at El Cedrón Cave in Spain. It was one of the first times anyone had pulled usable nuclear DNA, not just the more common mitochondrial kind, out of a Neanderthal specimen at all. They checked those bones for that same gene, and Neanderthals had the exact same human-type version of it, which means the biological hardware for language wasn't unique to us. Somebody else may have had it too and never got the credit. So the taxonomy fight from 1861, bow wow, ding dong, poo poo, wasn't just outdated. It may have been aimed at the wrong species entirely, which brings us to the actual open question researchers are still fighting over today. Not whether the hardware existed, but what finally switched it on. One leading answer doesn't come from bones or genes at all. It comes from something far less glamorous: gossip. Psychologist Robin Dunbar at Oxford argued in 1996 that early humans lived in groups too large to bond through grooming alone, physically picking through each other's hair, the way other primates do. Dunbar didn't start with humans at all. He started by comparing brain size to group size across dozens of separate primate species, then extrapolated the human number from that same curve. Grooming works fine for a group of 50. It falls apart once a group passes around 150 people because there simply isn't enough time in the day to touch everyone individually. Dunbar's argument was that talking is grooming that scales. You can gossip with several people at once. You cannot physically groom several people at once. That number, around 150 meaningful relationships, is still called Dunbar's number today, and it shows up in group sizes from hunter-gatherer bands to modern military companies, which reframes the entire question this video started with. Language may not have evolved so you could describe the world accurately. It may have evolved so you could keep track of exactly who owes who a favor, who's trustworthy, and who just embarrassed themselves in front of everyone, which means the most useless-sounding conversation you had this week might be doing something a lot more load-bearing than you think. So if talking is really just grooming with sound instead of hands, what does that make everything you say online, where you're not even in the room? Because the story doesn't stop at Dunbar's number. It keeps going straight into the device in your pocket. Here's the strange part almost nobody expected going into the internet era. Online networks didn't blow past Dunbar's number. They kept bumping into it. Studies on real friend and follower networks, including work Dunbar himself published in 2016, found that the number of people someone actually interacts with meaningfully online still clusters around the same rough ceiling as offline life. You can follow 10,000 accounts. Your brain still only has room to actually gossip with about 150 of them, which means the platforms didn't rewrite human social wiring. They just gave the same ancient wiring a much bigger room to sit in. But it gets stranger because of what people actually use all that talking for. Researchers who've studied everyday conversation content, building on Dunbar's own group's work, have found the overwhelming majority of what people talk about in person and online isn't facts, plans, or logistics. It's social information. Who did what? Who said what? Who's dating who? Who's in trouble? That's not conversation going off topic. Social information was always the actual topic. Here's the contrast worth sitting with. There was a version of this story where language research spent the past century and a half studying facts, logic, and vocabulary first. Instead, the ban from 1866 pushed the whole field away from origins entirely, which meant the gossip explanation, the one that actually fit the evidence best, didn't get serious traction until Dunbar picked it back up more than a century later. 130 years of avoiding the question because one institution got embarrassed by a few bad guesses in 1861, which is the quiet joke buried inside this whole field. The ban meant to stop bad theories may have delayed a good one by generations. Meanwhile, back in that jar in Paris, Tan's actual brain sat on a shelf for over a century before anyone looked at it properly again. In 2007, researcher Nina Dronkers and her team finally scanned Tan's preserved brain with modern MRI technology. Her team scanned a second preserved brain from the same era too, a patient known as Leilong, and found a strikingly similar pattern of damage, and the damage went far deeper than Broca ever described. It reached down into structures underneath the surface he'd measured with his calipers. For 146 years, the textbook version of where language lives in the brain was based on an incomplete look at one specimen. Broca wasn't wrong that something in that region mattered. He was wrong about how much of the brain was actually involved, which brings every thread in this video back to the same place. Genes, bones, brain scans, group sizes, none of them show language living in one clean spot. Language isn't a single switch someone flipped. It's a network that had to come online in pieces, across bodies that had been ready for parts of it for a very long time, which leaves one open question this whole video has been circling without answering directly. If Neanderthals had the voice box, if they may have carried the gene, if the wiring for tracking a social group goes back further than our species does, then what actually makes the way you talk to your friends tonight different from something that might have been happening around a fire 60,000 years ago? The honest answer is maybe less than you'd like to believe, because everything covered so far, the gene, the bone, the group size math, all of it points toward the same uncomfortable answer for why you talk at all. Not to inform, not to describe the world accurately, to stay inside the group before you get left outside it, which is a very different reason to send a text than most people think they have. And it means every group chat, every comment section, every reply you've typed fast because you didn't want to seem left out is running on wiring older than language itself. So here's the actual question worth asking before this video ends. When you talk, are you sharing information or are you just making sure you still belong? Paul Broca thought he'd found the seat of language in 1861. What he'd actually found was the seat of one small piece of it, the part that turns thought into sound. The bigger piece was never sitting in a single spot in anyone's skull. It was distributed across every relationship you needed to keep track of, just to stay part of the group, which is why a man who'd lost every word except one could still produce, on demand, the single word that mattered most in the moment, aimed with perfect social timing. That single word he could still produce wasn't a broken fragment of language. It might have been the most essential fragment of all. Language was never really built for accuracy first. It was built for belonging first, and accuracy came along for the ride, which means every time you felt weirdly relieved just from sending a text and getting one back, that relief isn't small talk succeeding. That's the same circuitry Dunbar described in groups of 150, running a quiet check on whether you're still safely inside the circle. It's the same reason a room going quiet when you walk in feels louder than actual noise ever could. None of that is new behavior. It's an old alarm, still wired in, still checking. You didn't invent the anxiety of being talked about. You just got a phone that can trigger it instantly from anywhere. Read receipts turn that old alarm into a visible, time-stamped feature, which is exactly why an unanswered one feels disproportionately loud, which brings this all the way back to what talking was for in the first place. So think about the last group chat you checked compulsively, not because you needed information, but because you needed to know you were still included. You weren't checking messages, you were checking your membership. Dunbar's own 2016 research found that number barely moves no matter how many apps you're on or how many people are technically in your contacts. The tool changed completely. The reason you're using it didn't change at all, which is why 163 years later, the jar in Paris still matters. It isn't proof that language lives in one place. It's proof we spent a century and a half looking for the wrong kind of answer. Broca's calipers were precise enough to measure a skull down to the millimeter. They never had a way to measure this, We kept asking where language physically sits. We should never have been asking who it was built to keep close. Tan couldn't tell anyone that answer. He only had one word left, but everyone in that hospital still understood exactly what he meant when he said it, because the meaning was never really in the word. It was in the fact that he was still, unmistakably, talking to them. So, it's your turn again. If losing every word but one still leaves you able to say the thing that matters most to the people around you, where does language actually live? Not in your skull, in everyone standing close enough to hear you. You didn't evolve to talk, you evolved to belong.